By the time the world first noticed Mary Wade, she was already a child fighting to stay alive. In the alleys of London, where smoke hung low and hunger never seemed to fade, she did what many forgotten children were forced to do. She reached for something that was not hers, hoping it might keep her going for one more day. She was around 13 years old when she and another girl took a handful of clothes from a younger child. Small things made of cotton and linen, barely enough to fill a bundle. It was not a grand robbery, just a desperate snatch at survival. Yet in the England of the late 18th century, even such a small act could bring the full weight of the law crashing down on a child's shoulders. Within a year of that theft, Mary stood before a judge who told her she would die by the noose. She was still only a girl. Mary came into the world in 1775 in Westminster, at the heart of London but far from its wealth. She was born into the shadow side of the city, where the grand buildings and polished carriages gave way to cramped lanes and sagging doorways. Her father, Lawrence, laboured wherever a strong back was needed. One day he might be hauling cargo by the river, the next digging holes, shifting earth, or working until his muscles burned on the docks. Her mother, also named Mary, tried to stretch every coin by washing and mending other people's clothes, scrubbing until her hands were raw in order to feed her children. There was no safety net for families like theirs, only long days and the constant worry that the next week might bring nothing at all. Their home, if it could be called that, was more a shelter than a refuge. Damp crept up the walls. The space was small and crowded, sometimes shared with other families, who were just as poor and just as desperate. Outside, the streets were clogged with mud and filth, refuse piled where people dropped it, and smoke from countless fires greyed the sky. Rats were not a rare sight, but a constant presence, slipping between houses, scratching in the dark corners where children tried to sleep. Illness spread easily, and if you became sick, there were no doctors ready to help the poor. If you were hungry, no school waited with a meal and a desk. Children were expected to fend for themselves almost as soon as they could walk. Mary grew up inside this harsh world. Childhood, in any gentler sense, did not last long. By 13, she had already learned to rely on her own wits. Work for a girl her age was scarce, and even when she found it, the pay was miserably low. So she drifted toward the same edge many poor children did, toward small crimes that might mean food in the belly. Together with a slightly older girl named Jane Whiting, just 14, she crossed an invisible line one day. They took a cotton frock, a little scarf, and a linen cap from a younger girl, Mary Phillips. These items were not jewels or gold, simply everyday clothing. They likely sold them for a few coins, enough, perhaps for bread or a meal shared between them. To modern eyes, it seems like an act born out of need rather than greed. But in those days, England's laws were known as the Bloody Code for a reason. More than 200 separate crimes, from stealing a handkerchief to cutting down a tree, could technically bring a sentence of death. Property was valued more than the lives of the poor, and judges were often ruthless in protecting the rights of the wealthy. Mary and Jane were quickly arrested. Once the law had hold of them, there was almost no mercy in the process that followed. Mary was thrown into Newgate Jail, one of London's most feared prisons. For a child of 13, it must have felt like being dropped into a nightmare. Newgate was a place of cold stone and iron bars where harshness was part of the air. The cells were cramped and filthy. Many prisoners slept directly on the floor, on straw that quickly turned damp and foul. Men, women, and even children were often held close together, their lives and miseries jumbled into one suffocating space. Disease moved easily from body to body. Food was poor in quality and small in amount. The smells of sweat, dirt, sickness, and human waste never really left. In this darkness, Mary waited for her trial. There were no kind officials to guide her, no lawyer appointed to stand at her side and argue that she was just a starving girl who had taken a few worn garments. When her case finally came before the Old Bailey, the main criminal court of London, in January 1789, it was over quickly. Her theft was not in doubt. She had taken clothes, she was poor, she had no defence. The judge listened, pronounced her guilty, and then spoke the sentence that changed everything: death by hanging. For stealing a few pieces of clothing, this young girl was told she would be taken to the gallows and killed. The judgment was brutal, yet not uncommon for the time. The law did not bend easily for people like Mary. She was led back through the prison to her narrow cell in Newgate, this time knowing that she was no longer just a prisoner, she was condemned. For weeks afterward she lived with fear pressed against her chest like a weight. Every day in Newgate brought the possibility that a guard might appear, unlock the door, and tell her that her time had come. She would have heard the sounds that haunted all who waited under the shadow of the rope, the distant hammering of gallows being prepared, the shuffle of feet as other prisoners were taken away, the muffled cries of those who knew they were walking their final steps. For a young girl, whose life should have been just beginning, the terror must have been almost beyond imagination. Yet somewhere beyond those thick stone walls, decisions were being made that she knew nothing about. Decisions that would spare her life but bind her to another kind of sentence. In the end, someone in authority decided that Mary was too young to hang. Perhaps a clerk, or a judge reconsidered. Perhaps there was pressure from above to reduce the number of children publicly executed. Whatever the reason, her punishment was altered. Her death sentence was commuted to transportation for life. The words were cold and official, but they meant that instead of dying by the rope, she would be sent far away from England, across the sea, to a penal colony where she would live as a convict. The gallows would not claim her, but she would lose her homeland, her family, and everything familiar. The place chosen for her exile was New South Wales, a new British settlement on the distant continent that would later be known as Australia. It was on the far side of the world, thousands of miles away from the crowded London streets that had shaped her childhood. For Mary Wade, barely into her teens, the future had shifted from a short, terrifying end to a lifetime of uncertainty in a land she could not yet imagine. When the heavy prison doors finally opened for Mary again, it was not to lead her to the scaffold, but to a different kind of unknown. In the summer of 1789, guards escorted her from Newgate and marched her through the city toward the river, where ships lay waiting like dark hulks in the water. Among them was the vessel that would carry her away from everything she had ever known, a ship called the Lady Juliana. She was only 14 years old when she stepped aboard. The Lady Juliana was crowded with women, more than 200 of them, most sent away from Britain as punishment for poverty-driven crimes. Some had stolen food, others cloth, coins or small valuables. Many were just as young as Mary, with faces still marked by childhood despite the scars of hardship. London's newspapers, ever eager for scandal, mocked the ship as a floating brothel, sneering at the idea of so many female convicts together at sea. For the women themselves, there was nothing amusing in it. This was their forced departure from home, a one-way journey that few expected to reverse. Life aboard was far from easy. The women slept below deck in tight rows of wooden bunks. There was little privacy. The air quickly grew thick and stale, especially when the sea was rough and the hatches were closed to keep out the storm. Salted meat, hard biscuits, and thin soups made up much of their food. Fresh water had to be rationed carefully. Sometimes the barrels began to taste foul after long weeks at sea. The constant rolling of the ship could make even the strongest stomach churn, and the sound of the waves beating against the hull became a constant drum in the background of their days and nights. Yet in some ways, the Lady Juliana was better managed than many convict ships of the era. The women were allowed regular time on deck when the weather permitted, to breathe air that was not trapped below and to feel the open sky above them. The ship stopped at several ports along the way, including places such as Tenerife and Cape Town, where food and other supplies could be taken on. Fresh fruit, meat and vegetables brought brief relief and helped keep some of the worst diseases away. Even so, the voyage stretched on, longer than almost anyone had expected. The ship left Plymouth in July 1789, and month by slow month, it crossed the oceans. For Mary, who had never left London before being thrown into Newgate, the vastness of the sea must have felt almost unreal. There were no alleys here, no smoky sky or crowded markets. Instead, there was nothing but the horizon and the creaking of timbers. Days blurred together. The women talked, sang, argued, shared stories of home and of the families they left behind. Some formed fragile friendships that helped them endure the fear and monotony. Others kept to themselves, wrapping their sorrow into silence. As the months passed, the thought of what awaited them at the end of this voyage haunted many of the convicts. They had heard only fragments about New South Wales, a harsh place, a young colony barely holding on, where labouring convicts were the backbone of survival. There were no guarantees there, only more hard work and strict control. For Mary, the future must have seemed like another storm cloud on the horizon, distant but inescapable. Finally, in June 1790, the Lady Juliana reached Sydney Cove. The journey had taken nearly a year. When the women looked toward the shore, they did not see a bustling town with strong buildings and busy streets. Instead, they saw a raw settlement clinging to the edge of the land. Supplies were short, houses were few. Many of the people already there were thin from hunger. The colony, still in its early years, was fighting to survive. Every new ship delivered not only more labour but also more mouths to feed. Faced with this strain, the governor made a difficult decision. A large number of the women from the Lady Juliana would not stay at Sydney Cove. Instead, they would be sent to Norfolk Island, a remote outpost far out in the Pacific Ocean, intended as a farming settlement that could help supply the main colony. Once again, Mary was gathered with other convicts and put aboard another vessel, this time bound for a place even more isolated than Sydney. Norfolk Island was beautiful in some ways, with its tall pines and surrounding sea. But for the convicts, it was a place of relentless labour. The land was thick with forest that had to be cleared tree by tree. The soil was difficult to work, and every crop planted carried the hope that it might grow well enough to ease the colony's constant fear of starvation. Supplies from the mainland were rare and precious. Punishments for disobedience were harsh, as officials tried to maintain tight control over a population made up largely of prisoners. Mary, still in her mid-teens, was thrown into this demanding world. She would have risen early, worked long hours, and collapsed at night exhausted. There were no comforts, few soft words, and little time for rest. Yet in this rough environment, life continued. Somewhere amid the fields, crude buildings, and battering winds, the shape of her future began to change. Around 1793, she gave birth to her first child, a daughter she named Sarah. For a girl who had once waited in a death cell, holding her own baby in her arms must have felt like a kind of miracle mixed with fear. The world was still hard, the authorities still strict, but now she had someone to protect besides herself. Not long afterwards, she had a son, William. On a remote island, thousands of miles from the London streets where she'd grown up, she was now a young mother with 2 small children. Their father may have been another convict or a free man connected to the settlement. Records from those early years are often incomplete and unclear. What is certain is that Mary carried her children through a world that gave them little, and somehow kept going. Eventually, Mary was permitted to leave Norfolk Island and return to the mainland. Her journey brought her back to the area around Sydney, which was slowly growing from a struggling camp into a more established colony. There, by a small stream known as the Tank Stream, which provided fresh water for many of the early settlers, she pitched a tent and tried to build a life. The conditions were simple and rough. A tent offered little shelter from storms or heat, but it was a start. Mary took whatever work she could find, washing clothes, cooking, cleaning, to earn enough food and small amounts of money for her children. These were not easy years. She was still a convict, still carrying the weight of a sentence that had begun with a stolen frock and scarf back in London. Yet she had survived Newgate, a death sentence, a brutal voyage, and the hardships of Norfolk Island. Now, on the edge of a growing town in a new land, she stood at another turning point. The choices she made next would shape not only her own life, but the futures of the children who followed her. It was during those early years back near Sydney, living close to the Tank Stream and scraping together a living through odd jobs, that Mary met the man who would walk beside her for the rest of her days. His name was Jonathan Brooker. Like Mary, he had not come to this new land by choice. He too had been sent out as a convict, torn from his life in Britain and forced to start again on the far side of the world. Jonathan was a chairmaker by trade, skilled with wood and tools, able to shape something useful and sturdy out of raw material. In a place where so much still had to be built, those skills mattered. We do not know exactly how they first spoke, or what words passed between them in those early moments, but 2 people who had both known poverty, judgment, and exile would have understood one another's struggles without much explanation. Over time, they formed a partnership, not just in work or necessity, but in life. They became a couple, choosing to face the difficult years ahead together. In a colony where official approval was often slow to come and records were patchy, such unions were sometimes more practical than formal. What mattered most was that they relied on each other, shared burdens, and raised their children side by side. As the years passed, Mary's status slowly began to change. She had been transported for life, which meant that in theory her sentence would never simply end on its own. But colonial authorities could, and sometimes did, grant official freedom to convicts who had served faithfully and caused no serious trouble. In 1812, this longed-for moment arrived for Mary. She received a certificate of freedom, a document that stated in formal words that she had completed her punishment and was now, in the eyes of the law, no longer a prisoner. For a woman who had once been condemned to die on the gallows, that piece of paper was more than ink and parchment. It was proof that she had outlived the sentence that had tried to define her. It opened doors that had previously been barred. Together, she and Jonathan decided to take a new step. They left the rougher edges of Sydney and moved to the Hawkesbury River area, northwest of the town, where settlers were carving farms from the land. The Hawkesbury region offered good soil and a chance to grow crops, but it was far from an easy life. Settlers had to clear thick vegetation, build their own homes, and learn how to work with a landscape prone to extremes. The river that gave life to the area could turn dangerous in flood. One season might bring generous rain and strong harvests, while another could be marked by drought, fire, or sudden storms that undid months of labour in a single day. Mary, who had grown up in cramped London alleys and then endured prisons and ships, now faced the challenge of rural frontier life. She and Jonathan worked the land as best they could, planting, harvesting, and trying to build something that would last for their growing family. Colonial life offered little in the way of comfort. Tools were precious, purchased with hard-earned coin or carefully repaired when damaged. Food from the farm might be supplemented with purchases from town, but there was no easy safety if crops failed. Neighbours depended on one another in times of crisis, helping to rebuild and sharing what they could. In 1823, disaster struck. A bushfire swept through the area where Mary and Jonathan had made their home. The flames moved swiftly, fueled by dry conditions and wind, devouring fields, fences, and buildings. By the time it passed, their house and tools lay in ruins. Everything they had laboured to build on that land had been destroyed. For some, such a blow would have been enough to break their spirit. For Mary and Jonathan, it was one more hardship in a life that had never been easy. They did not stop. Instead, they chose to start again somewhere new. They moved south, toward the Illawarra region, an area with rich soil and a milder climate. It was a place of rolling green and coastal air, where the land, though still demanding, was more forgiving than some of the harsher inland areas. There, they built another home, once again shaping a life with their own hands. The labour remained heavy, but the possibility of a stable farm and a growing family drew them forward. Mary's family was already large, and it continued to expand. Over the course of her life, she gave birth to 21 children, an astonishing number even in an age when big families were common. Not all of those children survived. Illness and hardship took some of them, as it did in so many families of the time, but 14 of her children lived to adulthood. Each surviving child represented a thread of her story that would continue beyond her own lifetime. Those children grew up knowing a very different world from the London lanes of their mother's childhood. They knew open fields instead of narrow alleys, bushland instead of soot-stained brick, and the salty air of the Australian coast rather than the smoke of the Thameside docks. They watched their parents struggle and rebuild, saw crops planted and harvested, felt the sting of loss when nature tore down what human hands had raised. They also saw resilience, determination, and the quiet strength of a woman who refused to let the worst moments of her life define her future. As Mary's sons and daughters reached adulthood, they married and started families of their own. The children of a once condemned prisoner became farmers, workers, and members of growing communities. With every new marriage and every newborn baby, Mary's family tree stretched wider. What had begun with a terrified teenage girl in a London courtroom was now becoming something much larger, a clan rooted in Australian soil, spreading across districts, towns, and generations. By the time Mary herself reached old age, the colony around her had changed too. New South Wales was no longer just a scattered set of tents and rough huts at the edge of a continent. More towns had risen, roads had been laid, churches built, and institutions established. Free settlers had arrived in increasing numbers. Society was slowly shifting from a prison outpost to a more complex community, and Mary's descendants were part of that transformation. She had lived long enough to watch a new world grow around her, one in which her children and grandchildren would play their own roles. As the years turned and the seasons repeated themselves, Mary Wade, once the frightened child locked in Newgate, grew into an elderly woman surrounded by the living proof that her life had not been swallowed by the punishment dealt to her in youth. In the Illawarra region, in the area around what would later be known as Fairy Meadow near Wollongong, she lived to see her family spread out around her like a living landscape. Her children brought their own sons and daughters to visit. Little, hands clutched at her skirts. Familiar voices called her name. Where once she had faced the world alone, she now stood at the centre of a vast and growing circle of people who would not have existed without her survival. Mary's final years were marked not by the iron bars of a cell or the cramped bunks of a prison ship, but by the ordinary rhythms of family and community life in a young colony. She had weathered fires, hard winters, lean harvests, and the aches of age. Yet the girl who had been sentenced to hang had outlived that judgment by decades. By now, the official document that had granted her freedom in 1812 was just a memory, but its meaning was still visible in every child who ran across the farmyard, every grandchild who helped in the fields, every marriage that joined her descendants to other families in the region. On the 17th of December 1859, her own birthday, Mary Wade's long journey came to an end. She was 84 years old, an impressive age in a time when many did not live nearly so long. She died at Fairy Meadow, near Wollongong, with family around her. The girl who had once listened in terror to the footsteps of condemned prisoners being led to the gallows took her final breath, not as an outcast in a prison cell, but as a respected matriarch, watched over by the generations she had brought into the world. Her funeral was held at St. Paul's Church of England in Fairy Meadow, and it was the first funeral ever conducted there. Even in death, she was at the beginning of something new. The land on which that church stood had been donated by one of her sons, a gesture that showed how far the family of a former convict had come. From the cramped misery of Westminster's slums and the shadows of Newgate, the story had advanced to church bells ringing over farmland gifted by her own child. By the time Mary died, she had more than 300 living descendants. It is a number almost difficult to picture. Hundreds of people linked by blood to a girl who had once been written off by the law as a criminal unworthy of mercy. Those descendants would go on to become farmers, labourers, tradespeople, teachers, and builders in a country that was still shaping its identity. As the years rolled on and new generations were born, her family continued to expand across Australia. One branch of that sprawling tree would even rise so high that a distant descendant would become Prime Minister, holding the highest political office in the land Mary had once reached in chains. Most of the people in that growing nation would never know the full details of Mary's early life, the cold of her prison cell, or the creak of the ship's timbers on the endless voyage to the other side of the world. But her story, kept alive within her family and later studied by historians, came to stand for something larger than one person's struggle. It became a symbol of endurance, transformation, and the possibility that even the harshest sentences cannot completely erase a life's potential. Mary Wade began as a hungry child on the streets of London, pushed into theft by need more than malice. For that act, the law tried to end her life before it had truly begun. She faced a system that cared more for property than for the fate of a 13-year-old girl. She survived Newgate, endured the constant fear of the gallows, and then was cast out across the sea to a place she had never seen. On board the Lady Juliana, she lived through a voyage that lasted nearly a year. On Norfolk Island, she worked and struggled in an environment that demanded everything from those who lived there. And yet, every time the world seemed to close in around her, she kept moving forward. She learned to survive in a new colony. She became a mother, and then a mother many times over. She found a partner in Jonathan Brooker, with whom she faced fires, floods, and the daily demands of frontier life. She secured official freedom, took up farming, lost one home to disaster, and then built another. At each turn she remade herself, not by forgetting the past, but by refusing to let it be the end of her story. Her life offers a reminder that people judged harshly in one moment may still carry within them the capacity to change the future in ways no one can predict. The same girl whom the courts once condemned became the starting point of one of the largest family lines in Australian history. Her descendants helped to shape communities, build farms, raise buildings, and contribute to the slow, uneven work of turning a penal colony into a nation. They carried her blood into classrooms, workshops, parliaments, and homes scattered across the country. Today, when people look back on the early history of European settlement in Australia, Mary Wade's name emerges not only as a convict but as a founding mother. Her journey traces a path from the narrow passages of Westminster to the open landscapes of New South Wales and the Illawarra. It runs through courtrooms, prison yards, ship decks, rough-timbered huts, burned-out farms, and finally into the quiet of an old woman's passing surrounded by family. Her story asks us to reconsider what survival really looks like. It is not just the act of staying alive from one day to the next, though she certainly did that against long odds. It is also the act of building, of turning hardship into something that lasts beyond a single lifetime. Mary began as a convict, branded and transported. She ended as a mother, a settler, and the ancestress of hundreds whose lives carried her forward. Though centuries have passed since the judge first sentenced her to die, her legacy continues in the lives of those who descend from her and in the history of the country she helped to populate. From the dirty alleys of her childhood to the fields where her grandchildren played, Mary Wade's life forms a bridge between two worlds, the Britain that cast her out and the Australia that grew up around her. Her story shows that even when society writes someone off, the future may yet hold a place where their strength and courage become part of the foundation of something new.